my blood ran cold, because I was thinking, the difference, for example, with an ADHD kid or an autistic kid or a kid that's got ADHD and autism and has got a diagnosis or hasn't got a diagnosis or is 8 or is 15, or, there is such a difference, like as different as my fingerprints. And so to then get prompts from an AI coach for how that then lands in front of a student is, I think, nothing less than dangerous.
Welcome to our Cross-Sector Lab podcast, where we are exploring the ideas and people that shape the future of education and innovation. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nicole Ponsford, award-winning educator, researcher, and EdTech innovator, and the founding CEO of the Global Equality Collective. With over 25 years of experience across teaching, leadership and policy, Nicole is a leading voice in inclusion, equity and ethical use of technology in education. So in this episode, we're going to be diving into her journey, her work and how data and innovation can drive real change in education. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure's all mine.
So I've got some questions to just start up the conversation. So if AI, because it is the topic, the subject, the matter that everyone is talking about, if AI can only optimize what it can see, are we at a risk of scaling inequality, especially when the most marginalized voices are still really underrepresented in data?
We absolutely are. If we take a topic, for example, how do we measure our students in education? We are still using traditional static data forms. So we are essentially looking at sort of attendance and attainment data, behaviour, provision mapping as well. And those data sets, there's a couple of issues with them essentially. So the first thing for me is, what we tend to do is we look at the what data and not the why data. So the what data is normally quantitative data, so numbers, and they are created in a way that we identify and we administer what those marks are. So to really kind of look at, okay, firstly, I'm sort of trying to unpack what you said about the marginalised voices. So my doctoral research for 6 years of looking at how we measure inclusion and belonging and thriving and engagement and mattering. I'm trying to get all the right words in here, Melissa. I knew that we have unreliable data. So what we tend to do is we have our mapping data, which is, our attendance data across the board. We have our satellite data, which are things like, English marks, for example, or maths, or, but we those are the sort of 2 layers of data that we have in education. The third layer is kaleidoscopic data, which is one that I've created as a result of my research. And the reason that I've done that is because I knew we had hidden voices, which tend to be our underprivileged ones. Because when we start to look at that mapping and that satellite data, we tend to collect very narrow demographics when it comes to the bucket. So we might, look at things like gender or race and ethnicity. We've got quite big umbrellas for things like free school meals, pupil premium, SEND, for example, which actually have very nuanced, very different markers, again, which identified. And I think when we are then looking at how we measure those things, we know that we don't identify all of our young people in the right way. And when I mean that, in a way that doesn't really represent them. So it can be, for example, if we think of free school meals, actually, if they self-identify, they might tell us that they, are for a low socioeconomic status, but actually they've not been identified as free school meals, which is what happened to me when I was younger. So that is a kind of a roundabout way of saying to me, I think for the first point, that when we're looking at the data that we measure, we aren't including all of our young people, and particularly our underserved young people, as part of that. What we're now doing in education, we've been sold this vision that MIS systems can basically bring together all the data we can need. Now, the problem I've got with that and the integration of then AI into it is what it does, it takes sort of a stance that the data that is in our MIS as being reliable. And what it does, it then amplifies and magnifies that. And the more worrying thing that I'm starting to see is when we're starting to think about student profiling using AI and what it's doing, because AI is essentially patterns which are created using computers. It starts to create like a causation. So if this child has got these particular demographics or has behaved in these certain ways, they are more likely to do this. And I think that's when we get into the real problems with data and AI being used together.
Which will impose some huge risks, won't it, into the stigma attached to a learner. There's always historically been stigma attached to a small pattern of behaviours or an ongoing pattern. But then if that quantitative information is kind of going to buffer together, that could really, put young people under a specific umbrella that they can never get out from again.
Absolutely. And I think, when we start to think about the way that we've done this in terms of attainment, and we can say that they've sat this test on this particular day in this particular hallway, with or without assistive technology that they needed, they are more likely to get this grade. And that's what we kind of have driving, so, the sort of skipping stones of their career in education. But likewise, we're now starting to see those sort of things being used around attendance, being used around behaviours as well. And for me, not only is it problematic in terms that one, we're not using reliable data in the first place, is secondly, it's given this kind of false sense of what will happen with these young people who, if we think of state school education, who are underserved, and more so now also in independent schools. But I think the last thing is the ethics around the AI student profiling. And what we're not really thinking, instead of thinking, oh, this is great, I can have a nice graph or a PDF I can like show all the governors, is actually, is this the right ethical thing to be doing? So part of the doctoral research that I've done, even though I was a school leader for over a decade, and then I was like a school improvement partner for an educational charity for a further 9 years. So it's about 20 years of doing this for schools and looking at data. I never understood things like critical data studies. I never understand. I know I didn't have a data literacy, and I think where we've got this like massive mashup at the moment of inclusion technology, and in particular large scale data models, what I'm now seeing is where AI is being used to simplify and make things easy, and so people feel that they can interrogate data, which they've not done before. Actually, what we're not doing is thinking about this from the best interests of our young people and the point of view. So, who is identifying? Who has a power in the agency? How is this data actually helping in? And is this really illustrating the stories of our young people that we would want to listen to and need to surface up? So to sort of answer your question, I know we've jumped straight into it. I don't think it does, and I've got a real concern of being sold this idea that actually having a plug-in of MIS and AI together, it's actually beneficial for the sector, when actually what I think we should be doing, because I've proven my research that this actually does help inclusion and well-being and does help from a leadership point of view, that when we start to think about AI in terms of assistive technology, when we start to think of the reasons we should use it in data, the reasons we can use it for more complicated technology which does illustrate the nuances of lived experience, that is the way that we can use AI for good. But at the moment, the trend seems to be doing actually more harm than good, I would say.
Do you think it's that kind of shortcuts? Because the second part that I wanted to kind of, we've already naturally segued into, is around that turning that real insights into something that could be meaningful and lasting change around a school culture, a school way of kind of working. And I have the same, I can think thoughts as you, that there is some great ways to use the data sets that we can pull through, including some qualitative that can, through a nuanced way, be shown and demonstrated. And you'd kind of hope that actually by something shortcutting some, heavy workload, heavy functions, and getting that insights, that the time then could be gracefully given to actually working directly with those young people. But my worry, I think, is similar to yours in that insight could become quite crude, and so we'll end up in a position that, well, they sit in that data set, so they must be now taught in this manner, rather than actually going, okay, I get this, now I can explore several different routes of craft or pedagogy into how I support that young person. And I think, I just the same as you, I'm just not sure if, where we are. So I kind of wonder, from your viewpoint, are organizations really struggling to take that insight and convert it in? Have you seen that? Obviously, don't discuss any out loud, any that you've been into, but have you seen examples of where it really has been a struggle to get them, have they struggled to use it in a beneficial way?
Yeah, and I think we're at a really interesting time. So we've got Ofsted who have introduced inclusion as a separate criteria. And as part of that, right up, one of the first bullet points you get is that they want qualitative and quantitative data as a way
Yeah,
of illustrating inclusion. So we've got that side of it. Then we've got the DFE who are shortly going to be illustrating a set of questions for pupil engagement.
yeah,
Which I think a lot of school leaders are looking as more of a sort of a satisfaction measure
yeah.
rather than a lived experience measure. And so that's sort of,
Net promoter
again,
score. It's a net promoter score, I'm sure.
that's it. And that's the work that, that my research has looked at, the kind of how do we put lived experience first? Because when you talk to data managers, for example, you say, or you speak to school leaders, they will say what they want to do is, well-being data is the most important thing. And then you say, well, what do you spend your time looking at? Well, I look at attendance, I look at behaviours, and I look at performative grades. So, well, how much time do you spend looking at well-being? And, we, for example, I've now working with 400 schools across 30 countries looking at this, and I can see that things are shifting. So where we've got Ofsted and a DfE, so we've got national policy starting to talk about data for inclusion. But what we haven't got is the infrastructure first around it. So I spoke to a school business leader just this week, actually, and what they were saying was, when we're starting to think about inclusion hubs, for example, we're starting now to think about students that might have two schools that they go to, or they might move across schools. So how does that work from a timetable point of view? How does that work then from a transport point of view? I know from the consultations this week from the DfE for primary and secondary schools, there's going to be a move for national provision mapping, so everyone can see where those children are and follow them, which I think is a fantastic thing. So I think that one of the new ways to think about this is from that kind of infrastructure and how AI and using patterns in computing, which is this kind of form of AI, that can really help. The other side I see are where, obviously, I've said about the data managers and where they are used to looking at data in terms of that what data, that traditional mapping and satellite data. Actually, leaders are going to be asked to look at data for inclusion. So they aren't just being asked to look at what provisions are being made. They are now going to be asked about how is that experienced, which for me, I'm really excited about. And that's where I think that AI can support you by looking at for example, with the platform I've designed, we've got 1.8 million rows of data timed by the amount of people that we've surveyed. And we've surveyed 12,500 members of staff and 22,000 students, which actually is more than the DfE have done. The pupil engagement survey from the DfE was 2,000 students, and their staff wellbeing one was 10 this year. So those large data sets that we've not really had before can be done contextually now. It doesn't just have to be an annual national report. We can now do this with live data. So for example, I'm sharing my research instead of chucking it in an academic thesis. We've got the inclusion index and I use AI to support that, and so every term, because it's live data, I can go in and kind of share that. So for CEOs of trusts and for local authority leads who are trying to look at inclusion and belonging at scale, AI can definitely help that, because I'm proving it does it. The last bit, I think, which where AI becomes really interesting then, is where we've got Senkos who have used AI for a couple of things. So one might be in terms of assistive technology, which absolutely makes the biggest difference, I think, from what I've seen. And I've been part of the DFE assistive pilot and program for a few years, and I've carried on that work. So I've seen hundreds of schools bring AI and the impact it has on young people. But also, I think with the kind of storytelling and how we work with others. So AI for assistive technology is one, but I think actually where I see Senko's, and I'm just thinking to some that I've spoken to this week, I think my concern with the automation, not necessarily about provision mapping, but about lesson plannings and strategies and their engagement with AI companies, I think that can be a concern for me. So, for example, I spoke to an AI company recently, and they said, well, we're putting in scenario building. So we get the data from the class, and it might say that, a child's got ADHD. And so what our AI can do is it can tell that teacher how to prepare best for that child with ADHD or that child with autism. And um and so my concern with the kind of automation, and we know that AI has bias, we know that it will leapfrog, we know that it's not always correct, is my concern then in the classroom with an automated lesson plan that looks like it's promoting equity and it looks like it's promoting inclusion, actually is really dangerous, because what happens when that doesn't land right? It will either impact that member of staff who's doing it and kind of be
Yeah.
concerned about not working, or in the worst case, impacts that young person who isn't doing that lesson right because it isn't following that AI prompt, which is wrong in the first place. So
And I think that's it. There would be too many rules in place. I think we know that one of the biggest, and I will use the word, failings in education at the moment around SEN is the loss of relational practice, because everything has become so crude. As you're saying, you give those examples of a type of learner. They're not a type of learner. They're a young person who has barriers to learning, which have a label, which have some of them have a diagnosis, some of them don't. But what is a diagnosis? You still don't treat the patient with the same medication. It depends on their weight, it depends on where they are in a process of that illness. And I think that's the bit that will get lost so crucially. And then we carry on with this escalation around SEND, or a young person full of frustration because even AI doesn't get them, and AI is supposed to get everything. So I think there's it could have a huge outfall. I think drawing topic knowledge as saving on some work energy for that teacher, that's different, that's fine. But actually the nuances around how to deliver that lesson, I think, absolutely agree with you, I think could be incredibly dangerous.
yeah, and I think it's where we've always, in England in particular, had an issue with edtech adoption, and AI is just another version. I mean, when I started teaching in 2000, that's when the Google browser came in, and it was, horror upon horror. People are going to type into, a search engine and come up with an essay and pass it off of their own. And that is just part and parcel how we work. And we're now looking at the next kind of, I suppose, revolution which we've got. And I think the thing that's different about AI is that people don't necessarily understand what AI can do, and so think it's ChatGPT, and that's kind of it. Where actually, if you look at things like Immersive Reader and Helper Bird, they are fantastic AI tools that make all the difference. And the accessibility that we can now get through, Apple, through our different browsers, for our different devices, is absolutely incredible what we can now do in a tech for good point of view. My concern is it's kind of landed at a point where we've got staff recruitment and retention issues and funding issues. And so that has become the main point of a conversation when it comes to AI, when actually as educators, what we should be doing is thinking about what is the best use of technology which helps fill equity gaps that a human cannot fill. And so one of the things I always say and kind of push people's attention away from, like, the use of AI as in automated lesson plans, because we've had, printable worksheets for quite a while now, and
Yeah.
this is kind of the next version, is actually thinking of, okay, what would what could that child in my class benefit from that I can't give them? Let's put my ego to
Yeah.
one side and let's see what I could do. Or even better, let's ask the child what they need, because
Yeah.
they've probably got a better view on it than us, because they are interacting with it in a way that we're not when they're at home or with their peer groups. And I don't necessarily just mean misogynistic, like manosphere bits. I mean, where you have got kids who, again, might be autistic, for example, and have got a special interest. And so they've got an online community where
Yeah.
they can be themselves like they can't be at school. They're all swapping ideas and different ways and creating social community groups. And I think what you said was really important. So the doctoral research that I've done, which I'll say that for the last time and stop showing off, but it's only because it's new, so I'm learning to wear it properly.
Have you done some doctoral research?
Do you know what, Melissa? I have. So there's a kaleidoscopic data, which is my third level intersectional data set, but this was all grounded on something called social capital. So although a lot of my work is around technology, and as an English and media and film teacher, inclusion has always been my thing, because school was my safe place when I was little, and that's what fueled me to become a teacher and fuels the work that I do now. And social capital is about the trust, the relationship, and the connectedness that we have with one another when we're in that physical or when we're in those offline communities. And I think what the technology does and AI does, it brings into sharp focus where the strengths and weaknesses that we have as humans in our sector and what we can do alongside it. So one example will be, working alongside teachers and teaching assistants using something like immersive reader. And what they'll do is they'll say, oh, this child can't read. So I used insert immersive reader, helper bird, etc. And then they use this technology and they said to me, Miss, I can read. This is amazing. This is the best thing ever. And everyone claps and goes, well, that's amazing. And I'm there furious that this poor child has only been given this tool then and could read actually if they'd been given the right tools. And so that's where I see the conversations, and I'm sure at the conferences that we continue to go to, which talk about AI and inclusion, it keeps moving into the data story, which I've sort of mentioned before, but it doesn't all, sort of reflect on the ways that we could be looking at education going forward as well.
I think so. One of the things that we've done with our ASDAN courses and the qualifications is really take on board how AI is being used, and as a force for good, and for that ownership and agency of a learner. So our courses are now digital, which they weren't previously, but it also means that we've really thought long and hard about how we can secure that they can all be contextualized, and therefore that young person can own the subject matter. So even if they're doing an English course, they can then say, the World Cup, whatever country it may be in, if that's their topic of choice, then the teacher could use AI to put the driving questions through that. Even though this is the challenge, this is the outcome I need to see from you, we're going to do it in the medium of the World Cup in America, so that kind of the oracy aspects of that are delivered based on. So I see that as how we should be using AI. But equally, that young person needs an opportunity to explore using AI, the facts that they need, the research skills to show I know how to look for things. And therefore, I really believe that they will then use technology for the best reasons rather than be distracted by the reasons they may not need to be using any technology, let alone AI. So that there is, we have to show them the direction of why things are useful, why things are good, why they're proactive, and give them some ownership. So I think there's a lot there, isn't there? And I agree, when you go to conferences at the moment, AI is talked about this doom and gloom of it's going to cause everyone to cheat. And it's like, that's such a minimal, low level issue that's sitting there, because we will have to find ways around that, because the world will just cheat anyway. It's kind of, we're going to have to find, but where is the goodness in it? And I think people are really, they're so busy worrying about failure, they forget about the proactivity, which is normal education conversation, I think. I just want to go back to one thing, slightly going off the AI part, because your expertise is way beyond technology. And I, at the beginning of our podcast, made a mistake, and I just want to draw draw us back to it. So I called Seb that it was a global equity collective, and it's the equality collective. So can you talk to me a little bit around that? It would be really amazing to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, so in terms of the language, I've always been really interested in, I think, pulling apart what we presume is going to happen when it comes to ourselves, our identity, and our young people. So, as I said, I had a bit of a chaotic background. I had absent parents, and because I wasn't very good at singing and rapping like my heroes, Nana Cherry and Salt and Pepper and people, I decided to go into teaching. And when I became a teacher, um, I realised actually the school wasn't safe. I heard how my colleagues spoke about the kids that would have been from my estate. I then, as a young teacher, I understood very quickly about the lack of opportunities I might get, and saw that as I went through, and not just in terms of having kids and things like that from a gender point of view, but working in leafy Surrey and having this accent in the English department, for example, or not having the shared background, or and I think then now as a parent of send kids, I see this time and again, and so what I didn't really articulate or didn't really understand was the different kinds of identities that shape us, that shape our friends and our families close to us, and how they differ as we kind of ripple out into kind of like what we see, so that the different kinds of lived experiences. And I think in terms of the data, which is what I always end up coming back to, when we look at those demographic buckets as well, what happens if you don't fit into those buckets? So, I should have been free school meals, but it was too shameful for my family for me to be in that queue. I was off the council estate, and there was a kind of a hierarchy, and my parents didn't want me to be from that family. The neighbours were, but we weren't from that family. So I wasn't free school meals. And we know that that kind of happens now. So I think when I started to kind of move through my different positions from like head of departments to like head of school and things like that, I started to be really interested in the difference that we had, and what opportunities we to get, because I think I blindly still feel that schools and education should be all about unlocking opportunities. And so one of the examples I normally give about the equity and equality is, imagine you're standing in the middle of a playground and you've got loads of plasters, loads of band-aids, and you stick them on all the kids. So that's the equality bit. They all get a band-aid. But actually, we don't do that. What we tend to do is we give them out when we know they're hurt in a certain area. We'll also think what kind of shape they give. We work out if they're allergic to it. We also now think about skin colour. We also work out if they want three or they want none. And so that's the equity piece. So the equity piece is sort of understanding the differences, and not doing a kind of one fits, for all. And so when I had to come up with a name for what I was kind of doing, which was a real world version of the work that I was doing academically. The Global Equality Collective kind of made sense because I had a huge ambition, and I kind of felt it should be international, which my work is now. And actually, we need to understand the equity first before we can move to equality. And so that's the area that I kind of sit in, that kaleidoscope of all the different shapes that don't kind of look like they fit into each other, but they all fit beautifully next to each other, like we do in our schools as well. And also, I feel we needed a collective approach. I think from a leadership point of view, we've still got too many egos out there dominating. We've got very loud voices, particularly, I think, with inclusion technology, because that's, everyone's either really for it or they're really against it. I saw a post about no PowerPoints and let's all read from a book and pretend that 30 kids will hang off our every word again. And I kind of think that actually what we need to be doing in education is kind of learning from each other, understanding the best practice. And again, to your point that you just said, it is very easy to get into the kind of negative areas. This won't work. I don't like this. This isn't for me, without flipping it and thinking, where are the opportunities for people not like me? How
Yeah.
can I best work with other people? How can I, learn with and from other people, and kind of bring in more of the optimism and positivity,
Yeah.
instead of seeing things as a challenge, see it as that, that opportunity to do better. And yeah, I'm quite a sunny person, so that's kind of where I try to sit.
It's really interesting, and the as you were describing earlier, the nuances around technology and how it's changed actually hasn't been that fast. It feels like AI's just suddenly turned up. It hasn't. It's like 25 years nearly of a slow burn. I remember doing my final teaching practice in 98 or whenever it was, and we were still drawing on an overhead projector sheet. And then I arrive in a classroom in a school, which, lucky for me, had technology already in it. But suddenly I was using an interactive whiteboard. I'd literally been drawing muscle striations on an overhead projector when I was in my last teaching block. But that was a massive transition, that era of sort of 99 to 2001, 2002. And this has actually been a real slow burner, but no one recognized it until it became perceived as dangerous. I think that's the kind of space, isn't it, that it's changed to. Um, so if we were thinking about a future, and what, if you decided you were going to go back into headship, and I'm sure you're not going to, but if you decided you were, and you had an opportunity to shape what that school looked like, and I don't mean the depths of the curriculum and things like that, but the kind of the use of what the world offers us today and brought it into the school environment, what would that look like to you?
Uh, I'd love to go back into schools, because of the needs of my kids. One of the reasons that I've been doing what I have done is so I could be there for the kids that need me. But I miss every day being part of a school community. And I have had people say, Nick, set up a school, set up a school. And so, that's it. That's on my wish list. But I think probably the main thing that kind of ties a lot of it together would hark back to when I was a media teacher, and the kind of the critical questions that I would want to encourage my young people to have. So, um, when it comes to technology, there's a lot about the representation and deconstruction of what we see in front of us. So if we think of AI, we've got our deep fakes and things like that. And actually, if we can help our young people and our staff better understand and become confident with technologies from a critical point of view, I think that's a key thing. I think, our education system started in 1944 with our first kind of fluid, all through, for all people, system for education. And I think at that point that was all about acquiring knowledge and being able to kind of illustrate that you had that knowledge. That was like the height of being social and being clever and being powerful. What we've now got is obviously immediate knowledge, knowledge in our hands, knowledge in our pockets. So what we need to do is be more critical about that knowledge and that understanding. And then the second part of that, I think, if I did have my own school, would be looking at how we could best create a love of learning from our young people as well. And that means um looking at it in the ways that they can engage with the content and in a way that suits them as well. So, I was an A level and GCSE teacher, but I then brought in BTEC. So I was an arts assessor. So I looked at a range of qualifications, and as Dan we had as well, of looking at how we could help our young people with more traditional qualifications, but also with a digital portfolio, for example, about links with industry, and all of those things I'm still really passionate about. So I think those are the things that I'd bring in. And then the word you mentioned as well was integrity. So my twins are 10, and at their school, they've told me that they look at integrity, and it's being kind when no one's watching. And that's probably the third part that I would put in, that's what I'd be really keen to look for. So those times when there is integrity. So maybe when an older student who had a neurodivergent diagnosis was supporting a younger one, maybe where we had reverse mentoring happening with our staff body, things like that. So I think those are probably the three things that I would start from. And I'd also look at a twin learning environment as the last thing. I think we're starting to understand that flexible teaching, flexible learning, adaptive, I'm not going to say adaptive teaching, I'm going to say adaptive curriculums because I think it should be that way round. I think all of those things are part that we need to bring in. So there would be a hybrid model. And I think I'd be silly as a leader not to think about that when we look at the levels of homeschooling and virtual schooling will rise every September. So that would be the next thing that I would look at as well. And one last thing I'd bring in would be the community and the parent and carer voice, because I've just launched the National Parent and Carer Survey, and I'm looking at how we can have better understanding of what parental carer, kinship, etc. voices and what the relationships are. And that would be something that I'd really want to kind of help co-design that learning environment with the families that I'd be serving as well. Not in a tokenistic way, but in a way that actually made them feel that they had ownership of those conversations too.
I absolutely agree, and we've sent that out to all of our members and stuff because I really think the value around parental voice. So obviously, there's a lot of listening that's happening in government, but we all know as previous head teachers, you send out the Ofsted questionnaire, and the parents that are unhappy fill it out, the parents that are happy fill it out, and or extremely happy, and then you've got those parents who just content and actually genuinely are content about things, and that they're happy to move along. And I think the problem we've got at the moment is the voice that's that's being listened to is the voice of those that are unhappy because the system isn't working, and we know it's not working. The children say it, the teachers are saying it, and parents say it, but there is also a voice there of, but we do know what good looks like. And those schools where they are doing it really well, those parents aren't being heard because they don't need to say anything because they're quite happy. So I really hope that through the work that you're doing, that kind of quiet but positive voice, the integrity, that voice that's there, I really hope that that can be collected somehow, and they do decide to just say, actually, this stuff kind of does work. Have you noticed it before? And I think, because I really think that's missing. And as you say, there's still quite a lot of egos, but there's also quite a lot of the same voice. And it would be really good, I think, to have a wide breadth of voice. That so there it can be seen. There's great stuff. There's stuff that just works simply and beautifully, and there's stuff that's not working.
Yeah, and although I haven't got all the data in, but what we have asked the parents and carers to do is to give the examples of where it does work, and they have. So most of them have given examples of when it works really well. They've obviously also said when it doesn't, but we've got both. And the thing that I think that has struck me the most, because I had a look before coming here, just is they do seem quite united in not necessarily blaming schools, but blaming the system. They know that schools are doing the best that they can, but they know that the word fight is said an awful lot. And I think schools as well, we know, Senkos are fighting for it, leaders are fighting for it, parents and carers. And many of them, because the way that I've done it is I've gone through lived experience groups. So I've got parent and carer forums, Net Mums Research put it on. I'm working with Ellie Costello of Square Peg and the rest of the GC Circle on it. And what we're seeing is actually, how do they want to be communicated with? Where are schools getting that communication right? What are the best examples? What does it mean? What does good look like? So all of that I will be posting and sharing those findings as well, with the view that we will then, as we've done our sort of our pilots with the GC platform, we'll be embedding parent and carer voice before the end of the year into the platform. So trusts and local authorities can kind of do that and scale, but it will be with a survey that has been co-designed with parents and carers themselves and tested at a national scale, which I just feel really humble that I can do it in this way and have the support, so thank you very much. But it's also showing when parents do have a voice, how they do want to help education. With Ofsted, as you said, I think it's 5 to 7% of parents fill out that nationally. So the parent snapshots we're getting, they're not universal. They're not illustrating, really what it is. They are illustrating from the parents who have time and ability to fill out a survey.
Yeah. I remember the inspection days where you're literally, I'm asking in reception, can you phone parents and tell them to fill it out? Can we do something else? Because I've said, well, there's not enough. There's not enough. It's like, it's because they're kind of happy, actually, and that's the desperate side of it, is actually a lot of parents don't fill it out because they're happy. And I can tell you the five that aren't, because they're the ones that filled it out, or as you say, they've got the resource or the capability, and there isn't a way to support those parents. Maybe AI could have a little work on that one, to be able to complete these things well. But I agree, and I'm really excited and looking forward to seeing what comes out of that, because I think it will be, our parents are the best advocates for children if they're given the support to be an advocate. And I think there's work that has to happen there, definitely. So Nicole, thank you so much for your time. I know you've got things to get off to do, and you're very busy, so I'm really pleased that you were able to make the time to speak to us in our podcast today.
Well, absolute pleasure. I feel like I've fire hosed you in the time. So thank you for the opportunity. And I could do this every day. So thank you, Melissa.